Welcome everyone. My name is Lindsay Warburton. I am in my living room. I have long brown hair and I'm wearing a black blazer. First things first, if you would like to turn on automatic closed captioning, please click the CC button in the lower right corner of your screen. If you have a question for the panel during this event, please use the Q&A button and write to us, and we will try to get to it during the question and answer time at the end. If you're having a technological issue, you may also use the Q&A button, and someone will work with you to resolve it as soon as possible. Again, my name is Lindsay, and I work as a policy analyst for the Episcopal Church Office of Government Relations in DC. I'm also a co-chair of the Interfaith Disability Advocacy Coalition, or IDAC, the organization who is hosting this event today. IDAC is a coalition of organizations in the faith community who join together to advocate for legislative and regulatory policies that ensure the rights and dignity of people with disabilities. And we are so glad to have you all here today as we reflect on the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. I would now like to introduce Dara Baldwin to give our opening prayer. Dara is a longtime disability advocate and activist and is a member of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. She is currently the Director of National Policy at the Center for Disability Rights. And Dara, you may begin.
Everyone. I want to center us today on this very wonderful occasion of the 30th anniversary of the ADA. But before we do that, I also want to center us and remember two giants that have passed away in the civil rights community, that being Representative John Lewis and the Reverend C.T. Vivian. My heart is broken. I knew both of them and was very honored to work with both of them for many years of my life. And I think the whole world is going to suffer from losing two great men, but we also are going to move forward and stand on the foundation that they put forward and work from that foundation. I'm going to bring us together. I call on the world and I call on the Spirit, those in which you believe in, to bring us guidance and to bring us hope. In this time, we are suffering and we are all being brought together because of a world pandemic. And if this pandemic does nothing else but show us that each one of us is connected, I know that those of us who believe in faith, who believe that there is someone, something that centers you, that gives you a North Star, that is what I call on, and that is what I ask that North Star to please continue to move us towards being peaceful and loving and kind and caring to each other. We want to thank you for the 30 years of the Americans with Disabilities Act, a civil right that provided a wonderful life and human rights for people who were thought to be, quote unquote, ugly, who were thought to be not part of the community. But because of the hard work and the love of people, they came together and created a civil right that made sure and ensures that those people's lives are valued and honored. And it is only through faith, it is only through whatever you believe in that centers you and moves you, that these things are possible. Remember every day to call on that Spirit, and say, thank you for letting me rise every morning and give breath. And thank you for having people who care about you. And at the same time, praying for and asking that Spirit to protect and cover those right now who are in hospitals suffering from COVID, those who are in hospitals protecting and helping those with COVID, and those around the world who do not have the things that we have, a roof over our head, food in our stomach, and safety and love. I thank you for this group and for the work you do, and I lift you up in prayer to whomever you believe in. And in this day, I say thank you and amen.
Well, that was beautiful, Dara. Thank you so much. My name is Aaron Kaufman. I am the senior legislative associate at the Jewish Federations of North America. I have brown hair. I wear glasses. I have a beard. I'm in my early 30s, and I happen to have cerebral palsy. And I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us today with a special welcome to Sally Warburton, who raised an amazing daughter. It is a joy to co-chair IDAC with Reverend Beadle and Lindsay. So thank you both for your leadership. I want to uh, tell you that we have three distinguished guests who are passionate about making houses of worship inclusive and welcoming to people with disabilities. I'm going to begin with we have with us today Rabbi Ambassador David Saperstein, a senior advisor with the Union for Reform Judaism and director emeritus of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism. Bishop Peggy Johnson of the United Methodist Church, she's a bishop in Philadelphia, and Mrs. Namira Islam Anani, co-founder of the Muslim Ark, which we will discuss later in the program. I begin with my dear friend Rabbi Saperstein, who will take the first couple of questions. We begin with you, Rabbi, because you were part of a coalition that lobbied for the ADA's enactment in 1990. So why don't you start off by telling us, because many people on this webinar right now were not born in 1990, or if they were like me, they were just a very small child. So what was life like for people with disabilities in the United States before the ADA, and why was the ADA necessary?
I think my name is David Saperstein. I'm down with my family at the beach in North Carolina in the Outer Banks. So I'm sitting in beach clothes with a white pullover shirt. Here, and for those who are old friends and know me with a COVID-19 beard here, as many of my friends have. I fully expected it would come in looking as dark as Aaron's beard looks like. To my surprise, it has come in a very different color here. So I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to be here. The Religious Action Center building housed a leadership conference on civil rights for 30 years. And starting with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965, civil rights communities' contributions were forged there. The advocacy on civil rights legislation for those decades was forged there, culminating in the end with the last bills we did were the 1991 bills, the Civil Rights Restoration Act, the Civil Rights Act of 91, and the Americans for Disabilities Act. It was a blessing for me to be in the middle of that, to see the extraordinary coalition that was put together dealing with the reality that there was so little legal protection for the fundamental rights of people with disabilities in employment, in housing, in public accommodations, in communications, just basic mobility around cities here, even government entities had done very little to provide for accessibility. And there was a 20-year effort really to put in place the building blocks that could lead to a comprehensive bill like the Americans for Disabilities Act that covered all of these areas. Some we have been doing building blocks in the Fair Housing Act in the late 80s, covered disability rights that got added to the 68 Civil Rights Amendments in housing areas. And we had already covered in the Rehabilitation Act of 73 a ban on discrimination in employment if federal money was paying for something. All of that was limited. ADA changed the world. It had some limitations. It wasn't much enforceability. You'll hear more about that later. But in so many areas of mobility, access, communications, it has made a profound difference here. I think we all know in employment, not as much as we had hoped. And again, we'll hear more about that later. And of course, the other big piece of it that required a compromise amongst many compromises is, as far as public accommodations were concerned, no religious entity controlled by a religious group would be covered under that. Employment discrimination was for any entity, religious or otherwise, 15 employees or more. But that was a huge lacunae that we in the religious community represented in this call have devoted much of our lives to trying to fill by our own actions within our religious communities, to say whatever the law says, we have an absolute moral responsibility to affirm the inherent dignity of every person created in the image of God. And that requires full accessibility and full participation. That is what we keep in mind at this time of reflecting on the ADA. Aaron, you're on mute.
Thank you, Rabbi. I really appreciate that. So my final question for you, that you've already sort of alluded to, but if you could go more in depth, that would be great, was why do you think the movement to pass the ADA was successful, and where did the ADA fall short?
Well, the full short part, I think I've covered, and I know others will touch on that. Let me focus on what the lessons were learned then from what made us work. One, patience. It was 20 years of building blocks. Two, redefining how we thought about disability rights. 20 years earlier, in the LCCR, it was the healthcare task force that dealt with that as a healthcare issue. And Pat Wright came along and said no. And based on Judy Heumann's extraordinary protest to Secretary Califano in 77, 78 to get tougher regs for the Rehabilitation Act of 73 provisions that we had passed, they redefined how we thought about it. And the password became disability rights are civil rights. And that changed everything. It changed the way we thought about it. Next, we put together an extraordinary coalition. When the leadership conference took this on with its 200 plus organizations, it already gave us an extraordinary coalition, but we were able to build a bipartisan coalition on Capitol Hill, a storied coalition. Hard to think of any Civil Rights Act since 64 and 65 that was as broad as this civil rights was, other than until recently the voting rights extension reauthorization bills that continued the 65 bill here. But we got Ted Kennedy and Tom Harkin on the Democratic side, and Dave Durenberg here, and Bob Dole on the Republican side in the Senate, and the same Cohen Fish and Steny Hoyer, Tony Coelho before he left. These incredible coalitions here, and Steny Hoyer moved this through four committees with bipartisan support in the House. It was an extraordinary undertaking. So bipartisanship, building the coalition, patiently putting together the building blocks of pieces of coverage, but also the legal theory in the Civil Rights Restoration Act that made sure that the ADA would be interpreted by the same legal standards that other civil rights bills were going to be interpreted in. All of this required enormous skill and patience from an extraordinary coalition. So as I look at the lessons for us today, and obviously along the way, tough compromises had to be made. And we were careful to build support from the executive branch in the first George Bush administration, as well as on the Hill, in order to do this. Boyd and Gray here and others in the administration really pushing for it. Those ingredients together marked how we got it done. Tougher to do today, but not impossible. And that's the work we have in front of us to fulfill the reality of full equal rights for everyone, regardless of abilities.
Well, thank you, Rabbi Saperstein, for your words of wisdom and your decades of advocacy, because your work on the ADA changed the lives of millions of people. But now, Bishop Johnson, I turn to you, and I'm really excited to speak with you. My first question is, what are the current barriers or challenges facing congregations that inhibit people with disabilities from participating in religious life or taking leadership roles in their congregations? You're on mute, Bishop.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm so happy to be a part of this panel, and I am a 60-ish looking white woman with gray hair and a purple shirt and dark glasses, and it's just a joy to have a conversation. And I own my own part of disability ministry in that I am a person who is blind in my left eye, and I have microphthalmia, and I wear artificial eye. So my whole life has been kind of interest in disability ministry as a part of my my baptism into disabilities myself personally. But with regards to your question, certainly faith communities still have a lot of barriers, partly because, of course, there's an exemption for faith communities that makes it like, well, we don't have to do it. Well, the law of love says we need to do it. We shall do it. Partly because mostly because people with disabilities are beloved humans, a part of the family of God that everyone has a right to be a part of. But the barriers I see as a bishop who is over about 800 congregations in part of Pennsylvania, Delaware, and the Eastern Shore of Maryland is that there is a decline in mainline denominations in general, less people in the churches, less dollars coming in. And some of these churches are rather old, and they have deferred maintenance, and they were built during a time when there was these cathedral steps that had no elevator, and the lack of funds and the deferred maintenance makes for some of our challenges for physical accessibility. But I would rather focus on the attitudinal accessibility challenges, because sometimes we are sorely without awareness. We don't know, we don't understand the walk of a person with disabilities, and that ignorance creates the barriers. It's attitudinal, and sometimes it's born of bad theology. Some of our faith communities might teach from the holy words that people who are with disabilities perhaps are so because of some harbored sin in their life, or maybe they should be excluded from any sort of leadership because the word says this and that about someone whose body is not perfect. So theology is another place where attitudes can go south. And finally, just a paternalistic mindset where people look at a person with disabilities and think pity, or I have to help them. We will service them. And that is just so not helpful when indeed everyone wants to be family. Everyone wants to have relationships built with people who are in the congregations with them. And the whole issue of empowerment is also sorely lacking, where very often there's a person with a disability who has great skills, who could be a wonderful preacher or Bible teacher, but they're passed over because there's some sense that they're less than and have an impairment, and they need to be serviced, but not put in the driver's seat to let their gifts and graces be seen and used by all.
Thank you. My final question for you, and I can see that Rabbi Saperstein is in agreement with your wise words. My final question for you is this. What do you think that the disability-related goal for religious organization should be 30 years from now when the ADA turns 60?
I hope I'm around for that. I hope I'm sitting around another Zoom call to say, oh, wonderful things have happened. I'm hopeful. I really am hopeful. I'm hopeful because of the moment we're living in right now, in which we are having heightened understanding of racism and the intersectionality between racism, sexism, heterosexism. This is all a one big package, folks. And I believe as this awareness comes, we're all going to be at a better level of understanding about our mutual humanity and the isms that prevent people from all the needed gifts they have, the giftedness they have that needs to be seen to the world. I'm hoping that future education and the intersectionality of it all will help bring us forward. I also hope that there'll be new construction sites fully accessible. No new building should ever be built without complete adherence to the ADA requirements. Textbooks, curriculum, videotapes, all captioned, all audio described, universal design. These kinds of things were just dreamed about 30 years ago, and now the technology is so much easier to get. It's so much more affordable. So I'm just thinking it'll just become a way of life. There won't be a, oh, I need an interpreter. There will always be an interpreter. Oh, I need this. There'll always be this. So I'm just hoping that we'll be focusing on justice, and some of the things we've won in this wonderful 30 years will just be expanded upon.
Thank you, Bishop Johnson. I really appreciated your insightful comments, and I just wanted to say amen. But I wanted to say before we get to our final panelist, and I'm really excited to talk to her, this is our final panelist. So as such, if you have questions for the panelists, please start getting your questions ready now, and Yuri will send me the questions. I apologize in advance if we do not get to all the questions in the chat. But it's my great pleasure to welcome our final panelist, the co-founder of Muslim Ark, Mrs. Namira Islam Anani. So you have heard from Rabbi Saperstein and Bishop Johnson, but I'm just curious, Mrs. Anani, about what, in terms of today's call for disability advocacy and disability justice, what can you tell us about Islamic teachings and traditions in this regard?
Thank you so much. I'm so inspired and hopeful listening to the other comments. My name is Namira Islam Anani. Here in my bedroom, my dark gray bedroom, wearing an olive headscarf, hijab, and I have dark glasses. And I'm of South Asian background. This is actually 2020 marks 10 years of living with fibromyalgia. So I've been navigating that life of really understanding invisible disabilities and how that shows up, chronic illness and pain and how that shows up in the world, and especially how that impacts worship as well as engagement with my faith community. So as a Muslim, I'm really just so grateful to be able to talk about this kind of aspect of our faith. One of the things that I find really powerful in taking the big picture kind of landscape view of disability justice and my faith is really thinking about the ways that Islam talks about different forms of disability, right? So when we look at the Islamic tradition, we see a number of different examples as well as stories that really provide lessons and wisdom for our modern day especially. So for example, one of the kind of commonly talked about stories within our faith tradition is the first man to ascend the Kaaba in Saudi Arabia, in Mecca, to issue the call to prayer, right? And the story is that it was Bilal, which means peace and blessings upon him, who was the first man. He was a black man who had a beautiful voice and was asked to ascend to the roof and to make the call to prayer, right? What's lesser known is that the second person to make that call to prayer was a blind man. And that's something that really demonstrates the impact of inclusion and thinking about the ways that our faith tradition really brought in people who were sometimes on the outskirts, on the margins of the community, and ensuring that, you know, like Bishop Johnson has mentioned, ensuring that people are put into positions of leadership, of authority, of agency, and not just kind of brought in a kind of paternalistic way, right? Additional kind of stories that are in the faith tradition when we're looking back at the seerah, or the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, when he first was approached by the angel Gabriel, he was terrified. He didn't understand if he was going through some kind of mental break or what had happened, right, to have somebody come to him like this while he's out in the mountains, right? So when he rushed home, he rushed to his wife Khadijah, and told her that he was really scared. He wasn't sure what he had just experienced, and whether this was something that was demonstrating that he was losing it, right? That mentally something was wrong with him. And Khadija calmed him down, wrapped him in a blanket, and provided care for him in that moment, listened to him, provided that aspect of holding space for him to process what he had experienced. And those are just two examples that I wanted to really show, just some stories that, you know, since I was a child that I've been hearing. Some broader things too. I love really talking about the way prayer happens. So, you know, Muslims are tasked with praying 5 times a day. And for anybody who has kind of watched how a Muslim prayer goes, it's, you know, standing on a oftentimes carpeted room, and bending, prostrating with your forehead to the ground, bending to touch your knees, right? It's a very physical act to take 5 minutes out of your day to make ablution, where you are washing your hands and washing your feet, washing your face, before you even prepare to enter your prayer. So something like that is a very physical act sometimes, and people have often struggled with, I can't physically do this, right? Like I can't physically maybe, whether it's through any kind of disability, whether it's mental health, whether it's a physical disability, whatever it is, I can't physically, you know, reach my feet to wash my hands or wash my feet. I can't physically bend, right? And so for something like that, there's so many accommodations, which is such a modern term for it, but accommodations inherent to the faith to provide space for people to be able to actually, whether it is that you are sitting in a chair to pray, if you can move just a finger, if you can move just your eyes, if you are able to just think that you are going through the motions and reciting what you need to recite at certain times, those are accommodations. When it comes to making ablution, if you don't have access to water, if you are too sick to be handling water, you can use dust, right, from something to actually wipe your hands, and have shortened motions to be able to do that as well. I just read this beautiful piece the other day about accommodations for mental health. If you are struggling with depression and 5 prayers seems overwhelming to you, what are some ways that you can actually combine your prayers, or pray one at the end of the time that you are praying that prayer, and then wait 5 minutes and pray the next one, right? And so these things are inherent to the faith. For 1400 years, we've been seeing these accommodations. That said, nowadays, in kind of the modern work that we're seeing, especially in the United States, you know, it has accommodations, and accessibility has been seen as optional for many, many people. It goes back to the issues around budget and funding, and the homes or the places, the buildings that Muslims are buying for mosque space, not having enough capacity or staff to really accommodate. But I think in this, especially in the last, I want to say 4 to 6 years in particular, new organizations have sprung up from within the community who are providing certifications to mosques and other places of worship to say, are you meeting our kind of recommendations for accommodations? Because we will give you a certification to say that you are accessible. Especially now with the pandemic over Zoom, when you have the Friday weekly prayer, usually there's a khutbah or a kind of talk that's beforehand, before the prayer. And that's often been live streamed to people to say, here's, you know, the 20-minute talk that's happening. But more and more centers are including ASL and an interpreter even during the khutbah. So you are seeing the imam lead and speak, and then you're seeing somebody providing both captioning, but then also ASL interpretation right there. So that's been a few examples that we're seeing, that we're noticing within the space of people who are really working to ensure that not only are we having this as a default, as something that is the norm within our spaces, but that we are working more to make sure that the space, given that our faith has such a strong ethos around accessibility, that we are bringing this into all of our spaces in any shape that we can.
Thank you very much. I really learned something, and that was beautiful. My next question for you is a two-parter. The question, first of all, is, in your faith, have you seen good examples of people stressing the maxims of disability advocacy, nothing about us without us, or being inclusive. And I know you also do a lot of interfaith work. So have you seen it in other good examples in other faith communities? And secondly, you are a co-founder of the Muslim Ark, which is a really great organization that you can describe. I have it written, but I figured you could do it more eloquently. But you focus a lot on intersectionality. And please describe what intersectionality is and why it is important to bring an intersectional perspective to our disability advocacy work. And last call to put your questions in the chat. I could talk to these three amazing people for an hour. So if no one asks questions, I have some additional ones.
Thank you so much. So some great examples. I think one example that I've often loved and the way that people have been operating this now. So for example, in prayer space, sometimes there'll be like a second room provided, right? And one of the things with that room is to provide places for like mothers who are nursing, just children to be in this room that's separate from the main prayer space. But I've seen some centers take the initiative to make sure that this space is for sensory, people with sensory, different kind of levels of sensory experience, to provide a space that's also more welcoming for them as well. So that's like one very specific example that I've seen that I really appreciated. But that mentality going into other events as well, especially with interfaith events, I think one thing that I've seen that's been really great is even just thinking about the fact to not have a default within that space as to who is in that space. So for example, like I mentioned with the prayers, is there a space for prayer, right? We really just need an open space with some flooring, right, to be able to make our prayer. But even thinking about agendas or different places to be able to insert some time for that. In other ways too, especially in the racial justice space, and I'll be able to jump off this into thinking about kind of intersectionality in particular, accessibility for the way we hold conferences and the way that we hold convenings and meetings. If you were in a room together with somebody for 8 hours, right, how often are we having breaks? What are the dietary accommodations that are being made? And what are the accommodations for the fact that there are different learning styles, and that, if it's always the same kind of format for how we are gathering when we're pursuing leadership and when we're thinking about a different world, how are we even entering that space together? So I've really seen some powerful work around people's even their name badges when you walk into a conference and using stickers to indicate various things, thinking about the ways that the room is structured, having a meditation room where somebody could go and take some time, having different kinds of seating, or it being very much verbalized in a space to say, please feel free to get up, let's have a stretch break, please feel free to sit on the floor, we're providing some cushions, right? Like thinking about all these different ways of really making the space not just one default as to who is in that space and who is sitting in those seats, right? And thinking about accessibility, absolutely, when it comes to entering a building, getting to the room, when it comes to interactive exercises. So at Muslim Ark, the Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative, this is an organization that I co-founded online back in 2014, and we launched on Twitter. So that was something that automatically shifted how we worked because we were online. And because of that, it was really beautiful that so many people who, for financial reasons, transportation reasons, mental health reasons, physical disabilities, they could not access some of the traditional spaces that we were having some of these conversations, right? And by moving it online, we were able to bring together these panels. Right now, this pandemic has been a total throwback for us to 2014 and the type of work we were doing back then, because we've been able to bring in voices that sometimes have been on the margins, but to make sure that we're presenting it in a format that is more accessible for people, this online digital gathering space. But as we thought about the online space and how we can make sure that's accessible, we also were thinking about accessibility in our workshops. So when we have exercises that we're facilitating a session, Some of them require people, traditional, the instructions for it would require people to stand in a circle for a long period of time, right? So all of these things, this is part of the ethos of it, that there are ways to make all of these things accessible. You provide chairs, you make sure that there's enough space for somebody who's a wheelchair user to move around. You provide different instructions, right? For anything that requires a lot of reading during a group activity, to make sure that there is material in Braille, or that somebody's able to read out loud the material rather than each person reading on their own. There's ways to make it doable, right? And to think about and include people as a norm. And I think that goes to this larger question around intersectionality, that we're in this space really unpacking race and issues of targeted identity and advantaged identities when it comes to racial categories and the structure of race. But the reality is that race, as when we see with intersectionality, Kimberly Crenshaw and other scholars who have worked on intersectionality have discussed how intersectionality is this theory that helps us understand that each person has multiple identities, and there are different overlapping and interconnected systems of oppression, of discrimination, that are impacting people differently. And by understanding that people's identities are multifaceted, that these systems are working and overlapping in some places and not in others, we then can understand a fuller picture of the human experience and of understanding fighting injustice and fighting systems of oppression. So something like that, really making sure that every single space we're in is accessible, but is also a space where we are challenging anti-Blackness in that space, that we are challenging sexism in that space. We're challenging all these different systems because the people in these rooms have different aspects of identity. Just as there are targeted identities in a system of racial oppression, there are targeted identities in a system that is so centered around ableism, right? That is so just constructed in a way that the world is inaccessible to so many different people. And as we're envisioning a different world, which is something we often do in racial justice spaces, we're trying to think, right? Like, this is how the world is right now, but what do we want to see? What vision do we want? With that, accessibility and inclusion comes along on that disability front as well, because we're thinking about a world that people are not struggling with lack of access to healthcare, that they have enough income, that they have enough financial resources, that they have a community, that there is inclusion and belonging. And ultimately, when it comes to disability, we really have to recognize that the issue is not with the disabled person. The issue is with a world that is inaccessible to that person. And that's something that, locally, Baba Baxter, and as well as some other local disability activists here in Detroit, which is where I'm based, have really been able to teach this to people, to really get us to shift the way we even think about accessibility, is that it's not about the person's making it such an individual issue, just the same way with race and other kind of systems that we see. It's about the system that we're in, and making sure that we are changing that to create a world that just looks completely different, where everybody can belong and can thrive in that space.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Anani. That was amazing and very educational for all of us, I believe. And we do have one question, a couple questions in the chat. And so my question is, can you hear me? The question that someone asked, and I invite Ms. Baldwin to answer this also if she happens to know the answer. She says, are there any efforts to get the ADA amended to include faith communities? How can I get involved in any groups promoting inclusion in faith communities? I will just briefly, before turning it over to the panelists, say that Shelley Christensen, who is on the webinar with us today, has a whole amazing website, Inclusion Innovations, and you can go and you can email her for some of those amazing resources at shelley@inclusioninnovations.com. They're geared towards the Jewish faith, but can be easily adapted to any faith. But why don't we begin with you, Rabbi Saperstein, in terms of, is there a push to amend the ADA to include faith-based groups? I don't believe there is.
There's been a lot of reticence to doing that here, simply because of the pushback for many of the reasons that were described about by the bishop about how vulnerable economically these institutions are, etc. That they not be brought under the bill. We've worked almost entirely from within our faith communities to try and encourage and come up with resources to help resources, the kinds of things you talked about that Shelley has, good ideas of how to solve problems in accordance with the means that someone with a particular institution has. I don't see right now a groundswell that would try to bring the religious communities legally under the Public Accommodations Act. If others have a different perception, please jump in.
This is Dara Baldwin, so I didn't describe myself. I am Dara Baldwin, a Black woman in my 50s, although I don't look like it at all. A turban on my head because my hair is growing. I've never had this much hair on my head in the past 12 years. And I have a black shirt on, and I'm wearing my ankhs, which represent the Black community, and many other things in faith. Thank you all for this, and thank you, Rabbi, for the history. I always love hearing history. I wish people would bring in, when they talk about the history, Major Owens, there were Black representatives who did help out with the ADA. Major Owens was one. John Lewis, who just passed, was another. You talked about getting Cindy Hoyer getting it through those committees. Barbara Jordan was very active, before the ADA, she had a disability herself. Shirley Chisholm, although she had left Congress, she had, laid the way for the Rehab Act and all. So we need to also uplift, Black representatives who were in Congress who helped out. You never hear that, from the disability rights community. I just want to say that. And so for the ADA, the ADA is not a perfect bill. There's a lot of it that needs to be strengthened. I would tell you, because I work every day in this on the Hill, and actually ran the CCD. I was a co-chair for the ADA Civil Rights Committee for many years, a task force. We in these Congresses do not want to touch a civil right. First of all, let me say this. Instead of strengthening the ADA, we have a Congress that both Democrats and Republicans are trying to weaken, The ADA, unfortunately, in the 115th Congress, February 15th, 2018 to be exact, was the date that Congress, the first time ever, weakened a civil right. I need people to understand and know that HR 620 was the first bill that weakened a civil right. Never has that been done before, and surely it was not done by bipartisan. We had 22 Democrats who got on that bill. That is disheartening. We had a human rights, quote unquote, icon support. She helped write that bill. That's Jackie Spear from California, who also is a person with a disability. So those of you who don't know your history, Jackie Spear was on that runway in Haiti when her boss was shot and killed, and she herself was shot, and she pretended to be dead. She has bullet holes and wounds from that incident. So she is also herself a person with a disability and supported weakening the ADA. So I just want people to understand the importance of that, and that we as groups are trying, we cannot, because what happens when you open a civil right law on the floor of the Congress, there are procedural things that can happen that can weaken it. And there are many people who are sitting with amendments that they have been trying to weaken the ADA. And that is their time where they can do that. And if leadership doesn't have a good call on their votes, that is not a place you do that. You don't, like some people want to open a Fair Housing Act, and add some more stuff. This is not a Congress to do that. When Rabbi was talking about 1968, to open the Fair Housing Act in the 1970s, those were good times. Those were when people actually were working together. That's how you got the ADA. We don't have those times right now. Let's not fool ourselves. We got a hate monger in the White House. I will say that, I don't care. And you have people of hate who are on the floor of Congress. And so while we have that right now, we can't touch the ADA. And LGBTQ community also is not included in the, gay and lesbian, that's not included as a protected class in the ADA. Under public accommodation, it is. Under some areas, it's not, because you had Jesse Helms, right? And then back in the 80s, remember, that was when HIV and AIDS, right, was very rampant, right? And so we are encouraging people. We know things need to be changed and need to be increased and strengthened, but not right now and not in these Congresses. And the last thing I'll say, of course, is the DIA, the Disability Integration Act, is right. Hopefully that the next Civil Rights Act for people who are disabled, and it will connect Title II of the ADA and the Olmstead v. Lois Curtis. I say, please don't just uplift Olmstead. He was a white man. It is Lois Curtis, the Black woman who, right, and Elaine Wilson, who wanted to be released from the systems. Do not uplift Olmstead when you talk about this case, but it will connect those two and say, people with disabilities who want to get out of the institutions should get out of the institutions, and here are the services to provide them. That is what the DIA does.
Aaron, could I jump in again just for a second here?
Yeah, briefly, please.
Right. I just want to, first, I really appreciate you lifting up some of the heroes that have brought us to where we are now, who are people of color. Let me just lift up the intersectionality piece a little bit with a little more detail here. In the Latino community, with a higher proportion of immigrants, the effort of this administration to deny people entry to the country if they will be using public benefits disproportionately disadvantages the Latino community. In terms of the trans community, here, the widespread obstacles to public accommodations to the trans community is a serious problem. Add on to that disabilities, and you multiply the challenges that they face. In terms of most communities, the African American community, most communities of color, the cycle of people being in neighborhoods that are lower income neighborhoods disproportionately, going to schools less equipped to be able to provide accommodation, drives many of those people disproportionately out of schools. Out of schools, they often end up in trouble with the law. Often the law sees disabilities as when there's an interaction as not being responsive to police orders, which create additional problems disproportionately. You end up in jail and your life is affected disproportionately. Less good legal protections, higher sentencing, all of the problems that are part of the school to prison pipeline for segments of the American populace, and particularly communities of color. Here, so all of these things in terms of the intersection raises serious obstacles for the intersectionality of the character of this crisis.
Right. Thank you both. And that was amazing. And thank you, Dara. And we only have time, unfortunately, for one more question, but Reverend Beadle has prepared an amazing closing prayer that I'm excited for. But I do want to combine two questions for both Namira and Bishop Johnson, and I ask you to be brief in your responses. The first question, the question combined is, what strategies have your denominations used to help persuade and support local congregations regarding implementation of the ADA? And do you feel that even though churches, synagogues, and mosques are not required to comply with the ADA, that we have a moral mandate to do so?
Well, I'll just jump in and say that the United Methodist Church that I'm a part of is big on councils and meetings and resolutions and books of disciplines and books of social principles. And so we have put intentionally lots of this mandate and encouragement and requirement into our very fabric of our laws and writings. But we also workshop people to a high degree. So training is a huge part of what we do to continue to get that in front of people, and certainly using people with disabilities to be our voices, giving the word and teaching and patiently working with people and bringing people along little by little. And I'll turn it over to my sister.
Namira.
Thank you so much for that. I love that aspect of the workshop piece, because that's exactly what I was going to say, to really start from that place of training. And we see this across the board, that people are not educated, but they also just don't have time sometimes to really learn how to do something differently. So making sure that there is that piece of, advocacy where it's like, hey, here's this resource, let's get you all together. But let's also be realistic about capacity issues and about lack of funding, or what are some of the barriers that have prevented change, so that way we can workshop this together and figure something else out. And I think approaching it from that angle of like collaboration has really shifted things. And then the other thing I would say about the moral mandate piece is that absolutely, I mean, I think especially as people of faith, I think that's why faith-based organizing can be so powerful, because for us, we're not doing things just for social media clout, right? Or because we're afraid of being canceled, or because of kind of the human aspect of things, though sometimes those consequences are very important, right? But we're also doing this for kind of our afterlife, for the hereafter, for thinking about, as people of faith, how do we worship God, and in what ways are we not properly worshiping when we are enabling oppression and injustice against marginalized people in our community. And that has been kind of a powerful reminder for people to say, this is a moral mandate. This is your problem. This is something that you should be thinking about. And here, let's figure out how to help.
Thank you. And I just want to say what an inspiring hour this has been. I am so motivated and so inspired by our wonderful panelists. Thank you, Namira. Thank you, Bishop Johnson. Thank you, Rabbi Saperstein. Thank you, Dara. And thanks to all of you. And the icing on the cake for this wonderful lunch hour together will be a prayer as we move about our day to conclude the program from Reverend Michelle Beadle.
I do want to thank everybody, and it has been a delight to listen and to be so inspired by everything that I've heard today. Again, I'm Reverend Michelle Beadle. I work for the General Board of Church and Society with the United Methodist Church. I'm also, though, ordained with the United Church of Christ. I'm grateful for all the ways that we celebrate and worship the source of all life. I have shoulder-length brown hair and blue eyes. I'm approaching 50 years old. I'm wearing a black blouse with short sleeves and white and blue flowers on it. I'm grateful to be the mother of 2 beautiful children, one of whom does happen to be on the autistic spectrum. I do invite us all, my friends, to gather now for a time of reflection and recommitment, to reach out in this moment to that one whom we revere, the one whom we name as that source of all life and all love, the one who we declare to be the author of justice. And as we turn our hearts and minds to that magnificence, let's offer our gratitude. Almighty One, we are grateful for our ancestors and for our elders who championed the causes of human dignity and insisted that differences in communication and variations in bodies and neurodiversity are not weaknesses, but each and all contribute in their own way to the greatness and to the unfolding potential of this miracle that is called our human family. We're grateful for those who continue the work of disability rights, who share their prophetic voice, who relish in creativity and ingenuity and innovation, and who delight in showing an otherwise resistant world that there is indeed a way for all people to be included and empowered, to participate and to grow in their potential. Almighty One, let it be that we find ourselves counted among such as these. As we leave this time together, renew our passion for disability justice and inspire us to find new and lasting ways to tear down the artificial barriers of body and mind that separate us from one another. Enable us to live boldly into a world that reflects your salam, your peace, your shalom, your shanti. Amen. Go in peace, my friends.
That was amazing. And we invite you to Michelle, that was just so beautiful. And we invite you to like IDAC on Facebook, and we will be in touch. And thank you again to our amazing panelists. And Lindsay, you want to close us out? I'm just so moved by everything I've heard in the last hour.
Yes, I am as well. I can't thank our panelists and enough, and Dara as well. If you have any questions or comments, I put my email in the chat. A recording will be available after that. We will send out to the group. Please let us know if there's anything else. And thank you, and God be with you. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Peace and blessings.